I want you to think about for a minute walking a dog. You know, you've got one dog on a leash. It may pull a little bit, but you can keep it under control because it's just one dog, right? But then imagine now having 3 or 4 dogs on leashes. Okay, now things are getting difficult, right? They're all pulling in different directions. You've got a hold of the leashes. You can still control them, but you have to exert a lot more effort. You have to lean back more, add your muscle, and if one of them pulls in a direction you don't expect, it might cause you to trip just a little bit. But then imagine having 8 or 10 dogs on a leash. And they're gonna take you wherever they want to go, right? You're not gonna be able to control them. They're gonna pull you right off your feet. I saw a video on YouTube of this very thing happening. A dog walker in some big city, and she had a whole ton of dogs on leashes. And then a squirrel ran across, and they all took off after it. And it literally pulled her off her feet and dragged her across the grass. She had no control over those dogs. Now, with that kind of concept, I wanted to think about the dog as being something like occasional time with unbelieving family, like some worldly influences in our lives. You know, 1 or 2 worldly influences in our lives aren't going to pull us away. You can keep control of them. You can keep them from dragging you off. But if you start adding more and more worldly influences, maybe you've got more time with unbelieving friends and family and coworkers. You're adding in their worldly entertainment. It starts to become like having multiple dogs on leashes where, okay, you may be able to keep control, but you're having to exert an awful lot of effort. You're having to put more of your willpower into keeping yourself from being pulled off your feet. But then, what happens if you add even more worldly influences? Maybe you've now got not just time with your unbelieving friends and family, but you're doing so while they're engaging in sin. You're engaging in entertainment that glorifies sin. Maybe you're spending time at bars or clubs. Maybe you're engaging with worldly music and books and movies and podcasts. And it's like having 10 or 12 dogs on leashes. You think you might be able to control them. But just like that dog walker, you end up getting pulled off your feet. You end up getting pulled into sin. Now, I have to apologize just for a minute because I can see by the slide that this is an older version of my PowerPoint. So I apologize. There's probably not going to be underlining for your handouts. So I apologize about that. But we see that influence that the world has on us. Now, I like this analogy of the dog walkers because the answer is relatively simple. You let go of the leashes, right? All those dogs are pulling you off your feet. You let go. But what people do, people want to hold on to those worldly influences, thinking they can control them, when in fact it's the worldly influences that are controlling them. Now, this is very similar to what happened with Judah and Jerusalem before the time of Zephaniah. They allowed the worldly influences of the nations around them to control them, to pull them around. And so today, we're continuing our sermon series on enduring God's punishment, looking at some lessons from Zephaniah. The second lesson in this series is titled, Look Around. And it talks about the wrath on all the nations. Now, what we're going to do today is much like what we did last week, where we're going to look at the lesson for Zephaniah's time. Then we're going to look at the lesson for our time, or some lessons for our time. And I want, as we go through this, I want you to think about the influences you allow in your life. Friends, family, entertainment choices, places that you spend time. And what worldly influences do you allow in your life? We all have some, but what do you allow? With that in mind, let's go to Zephaniah chapter 2 and look at the message for Zephaniah's time. Zephaniah chapter 2. And Zephaniah chapter 2 and going into chapter 3, we have divided into directions. He's going to talk about the west, the east, the north, the south, and then finally Judah and Jerusalem in the center. So, verses 4 through 7, woe to the coastlands. Zephaniah 2, starting in verse 4. And he says, for Gaza will be abandoned, and Ashkelon a desolation. Ashdod will be driven out at noon, and Ekron will be uprooted. We're not going to go into all the details of these particular cities, but each of these is a seacoast city of the Philistines. Hey, that's great. It does have the underlining, so we're good. Cool. But these are seacoast cities of the Philistines. Now, if you remember the Philistines, well, the Jews were supposed to totally wipe them out in the conquest of Canaan. You remember God gave them the instruction, go into the land of Canaan and totally wipe out, push out all the people of the land. But they failed to do so. They were scared. You remember them talking about how, we're grasshoppers in their sight. And they were frightened. And rather than pushing the Philistines out, rather than wiping them out, they left them in the area. And so the Philistines were a constant military and spiritual danger throughout the nation's history. They stayed being a danger for the entirety of the nation's history up to this point. At various times, they fought wars against each other. You remember King David, when he fought the Philistines. At times, he even joined the Philistines, and he fought against them again. And there was war after war against the Philistines. But also at times, the Jews adopted the false gods of the Philistines. They adopted those false gods. Let's go to Judges 10 real quick and just look at Judges 10 verse 6. It says, then the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. Served the Baals and the Ashtaroth, the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the sons of Ammon, the gods of the Philistines. Thus they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. So rather than serving the one and only true God who did all these amazing miracles for them, they went off and they served the false gods of the surrounding nations. And so going back to Zephaniah 2, God says what he's going to do. He says, woe to the inhabitants of the seacoast, the nation of the Cherethites. The word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines. And I will destroy you so there will be no inhabitant. So the seacoast will be pastures with caves for shepherds and folds for flocks. And the coast will be for the remnant of the house of Judah. They will pasture on it. In the house of Ashkelon they will lie down at evening. For the Lord their God will care for them and restore their fortunes. We see here that God was going to do what the people failed to do. He was going to wipe them out. And he was going to use the Babylonians to do what the Jews failed to do. Now, just pausing right there, the people of God failed, and so God is going to have to use a sinful nation to do what they didn't do, to utterly wipe out the Philistines. And we know from history that they did. The Babylonians, when they came in, they wiped out the Philistines, and after the Jews come back from the Babylonian captivity, we don't see anything about the Philistines. They're no longer a people in that area. They're gone. The Jews occupy that area. Now, in Zephaniah 2, he moves to the east. You see, he started in the west, now he goes to the east. And we're going to see woe to the eastern land. Zephaniah 2, starting in verse 8, he says, I have heard the taunting of Moab and the revilings of the son of Ammon, with which they have taunted my people and become arrogant against their territory. Okay, so Moab and Ammon, both the Moabites and the Ammonites were descendants from Lot. Lot was Abraham's nephew. So this makes them distant cousins of the Jews. Now, we're not going to go and read those passages about them, but you can look those up in your own time. They're on the handout. These are distant cousins of the Jews. Now, in the conquest of Canaan, God told the Jews, don't wipe out the Moabites and Ammonites. They're your kin. They're your distant cousins. But throughout their history, the Ammonites and the Moabites had been first enemies of the Jews. They at times fought wars against the Jews. At times they were allies of the Jews. So they'd flip-flop. Sometimes they were allies, sometimes they were enemies. Sometimes they were subjects to the Jews, under the foot of the Jews, as it were. Sometimes they were conspirators against the Jews, saying that they were having an alliance with the Jews, but then secretly conspiring with the enemies of the Jews. And in fact, in another of the minor prophets, it talks about how the Moabites laid in wait for the Jews fleeing Jerusalem to rob them on the road as they were fleeing from the Babylonians. And just like the Philistines, at times the Jews adopted the false gods of the Moabites and the Ammonites. At times they adopted those false gods. They followed their idols. And so God says of them, "Therefore, as I live, declares the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab will be like Sodom, and the sons of Ammon like Gomorrah, a place possessed by nettles and salt pits, and a perpetual desolation. The remnant of my people will plunder them, and the remainder of my nation will inherit them." You remember Sodom and Gomorrah, that God wiped out with fire from heaven. He says, Moab and Ammon are going to be like that. Wiped out. No one left. So again, just like with the Philistines, God would use the Babylonians to punish them for their treachery and idolatrous influence. God was going to punish them. Again, he was going to use the Babylonians to do so. And he was going to give their lands to the Jews, which is exactly what we see play out when the Jews return from Babylonian captivity. He says, "This they will have in return for their pride, because they have taunted and become arrogant against the people of the Lord of hosts. The Lord will be terrifying to them, for he will starve all the gods of the earth, and all the coastlands of the nations will bow down to him, everyone from his own place." I love this. This is cool. The Lord, he will starve out all the gods of the earth. Now, what an interesting phrase. Starve out. Well, first off, we know that these false gods are not real deities. They're false gods. Paul talks about how an idol is nothing. It's empty. So how can you starve something that is nothing? Well, you think about where these false gods exist. They exist in the hearts and minds of the people who worship them. And so when the people are wiped out and there's no one left to worship those false gods basically cease to be. They only exist in the history books. And some of them have even been lost to history. So the God will starve out all of these false gods. See, the one and only true God always wins out against all false gods. And we need to remember that. This isn't one of those situations like from Greek mythology where the gods could overpower one another. The one and only true God is in no risk of being overpowered. Nothing, no one has power over him. He will always win out. Now, God in Zephaniah talks about woe to the north and the south. And the south he's only going to mention very briefly. He says, "You also, O Ethiopians, will be slain by my sword." Now, Ethiopia is south of Egypt. It's way down there. And then he goes north. And he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria. And he will make Nineveh a desolation, parched like the wilderness. So again, both the Ethiopians and the Assyrians had battled against the Jews many times, had allied against them, had gone up and done various battles against them, and the Assyrians even took the northern kingdom off into captivity. So these are long-standing enemies of the Jews. And just like the others, at various times the Jews had adopted the false gods of the Ammonites. There's a trend here, isn't there? He goes on, he says, "Flocks will lie down in her midst," her here being Nineveh, the capital city of Assyria. "Flocks will lie down in her midst. All beasts which range in herds, both the pelican and the hedgehog, will lodge in the tops of her pillars. Birds will sing in the window. Desolation will be on the threshold, for he has laid bare the cedar work." Now, you notice that bit about the hedgehogs. I just want to bring this up because it might be confusing. Your translation may say something different than hedgehogs. The Hebrew word here, they're not sure what animal it refers to. It's a big question mark. So some translations say hedgehogs, others use a type of bird, others will talk about some other kind of animal. Your translation probably says something different than hedgehogs. Basically, the animals of the wilderness, the various types of animals that live in the wilderness, will make their homes in Nineveh, this great city. There's going to be wild animals living in its streets. This is the exultant city which dwells securely, who says in her heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. How she has become a desolation, a resting place for beasts. Everyone who passes by her will hiss and wave his hand in contempt. So this is a nation, a city that used to rule over other nations. And God says it's going to be a desolation to the point that as people walk by, they're going to hiss and shake their hand at it. Just think about that, like going past the ruins of a city and going, people are going to revile it. They're going to ridicule it. Again, just like the other nations mentioned, God would use the Babylonians to bring them to ruin, as they had done to so many others. They were going to get what they had given, but many times over. So that's the nations around. But now God is going to bring it home, as it were. And he's going to talk about in chapter 3, verse 1 through 7, woe to Jerusalem and the nations. Now you remember, looking at all these nations around them, Judah and Jerusalem allowed the influence of the surrounding nations to corrupt them at every level. That's the whole purpose of this book. Judah and Jerusalem allowed those other nations to influence them. But you notice these weren't friendly nations. It's not like these were nations that were, going out of their way to make the life of the Jews better. These were enemies, people who had spent their time trying to destroy the Jews. And yet the Jews conformed to those other nations. And he says, woe to her who is rebellious and defiled, the tyrannical city. She heeded no voice, she accepted no instruction. She did not trust the Lord, she did not draw near to her God. Now, this is why we know that this is talking about Jerusalem. God is the God of the whole earth, but the people of Jerusalem were God's people. God is the God of Judah and Jerusalem. So this is talking about his people, not about Nineveh or one of the other nations. And you notice how he kind of humanizes the city itself. Talks about the city as if it's a person. We see that the people of Jerusalem in general had abandoned God and embraced sin. And this is important because it's not just the leaders. It's not just the political people. It's not just the priests. Everybody in the city, in the nation, there was a few holdouts, but the vast majority of people had abandoned God. They'd gone to sin. And then he gets more specific. Her princes within her are roaring lions. Her judges are wolves at evening. They leave nothing for the morning. So the social and political leaders of the nation had adopted the corruption of their neighbors. Rather than following God's law, God's instructions, they had conformed to the nations around them, becoming selfish and backbiting and damaging to their very own people. But it didn't stop there. Her prophets are reckless, treacherous men. Her priests have profaned the sanctuary. They have done violence to the law. The priests, the people that are supposed to be maintaining the sanctuary, the people who are supposed to be teaching God's law, even the religious leaders were causing harm and promoting evil. That's bad. When not just the political people, but also the religious leaders were causing harm and promoting evil. And then he contrasts that sinful activity with the Lord. He says, the Lord is righteous within her. He will do no injustice. Every morning he brings his justice to light. He does not fail, but the unjust knows no shame. So the people, they've left God. They've abandoned him. They're doing their own thing, following the influence of the nations. But despite their sin and corruption, God continued to be just and righteous. They were corrupt, but he continued to be the just and righteous God. However, this means that he punishes those who do evil. God's justice demands that those who are evil get punished for it. And so he says this, I have cut off nations. Their corner towers are in ruins. I have made their streets desolate, with no one passing by. Their cities are laid waste without a man, without an inhabitant. I said, surely you will revere me, accept instruction. So her dwelling will not be cut off according to all that I have appointed concerning her. But they were eager to corrupt all their deeds. So he's given them that instruction, that example that he judges nations. They've seen him judge nations. And yet, they all became corrupt. They were eager to go into corruption. See, in his justice and his righteousness, God would use Babylon to punish the sins of Judah along with her neighbors. God is just, and he used Babylon as his tools. Why? Because Judah and Jerusalem allowed the influence of the surrounding nations to corrupt them at every level. That's why. They allowed that influence to corrupt them. And we see that from chapter 1 when they were taking on the culture of those surrounding nations. They were adopting the gods of those surrounding nations. They were letting that influence change who they were. Now that's the lesson for Zephaniah's time. Let's now talk about some lessons for our time. Because very similar to Zephaniah's time, we live in a sinful culture. And I'm not talking about this, the lessons I'm going to talk about aren't political or national on scale. This is personal on scale. I hope that this is a surprise to you, but America is not a Christian nation. America is not a godly nation. America is not a good nation surrounded by sinful ones. America is just as sinful as any nation, full of corruption. The church, God's people, are his people surrounded by a sinful culture. You don't have to look far in our American culture to see how corrupt and sinful it is. And being surrounded by that sinful culture, it's easy to want to conform to it. It's easy to want to start to become like those people around us. Let's read about some of the corruption that we see in the world. Let's go to Romans 1. Now, we really could do all of Romans 1, but for the sake of time, we're going to look at verses 28 through 32. Romans 1, 28 through 32 says, and just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do the things which are not proper. Now, listen to this list that he gives and think about if any of this applies to the culture surrounding us. Being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful, and although they knew the ordinances of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. Well, while that list was specifically written about Paul's time, it applies just as much to our culture. That could just as easily be written about America as it could have been about Rome. So we are surrounded by people who are steeped in sin. Not just people who occasionally commit sin, but people who are steeped in it, who spend all their time soaked in sin. And it is far too easy to begin imitating the people who surround us. You know, we as humans, we like groups. We want to be around people, and we want to have a group that we feel like we're part of. And so we conform ourselves to the people we spend time with. And when we spend vast amount of times surrounded by sinful influences, we become like those sinful influences. Now, here's what happens. Someone will say, oh, no, not me. I am so strong. I am so mature. I am so steadfast. I can go stand in a pool of sin and not be touched by it. That's an interesting thought. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 33 through 34. This passage says, "Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals." Such a simple statement, right? Bad company corrupts good morals. A lot of times we think about this when we talk to kids about it, like, oh, don't spend time, kids, with bad influences. They're going to corrupt you. But this isn't written exclusively to children. This is written for all of us. See, too many Christians indulge in sinful influences, thinking they can resist the temptation. Oh, I'm strong enough. I can go and maybe spend time with my non-Christian friends at a bar while they're all drinking. I can spend time with my druggy friends while they're all getting high and not be touched by it. I can watch whatever movies I want to watch, no matter what sin is being depicted in graphic detail. And I'm mature enough to not be touched by it. Many Christians indulge those sinful influences. Maybe you do too. Maybe you indulge. I'm using that word indulge on purpose. It feels good. I want to do it. So I'm going to indulge in that sinful influence. This text says they're deceiving themselves. And if you or I is doing the same thing, we're deceiving ourselves. If you're indulging sinful influences in your life and thinking you can resist the temptation, you're lying to yourself. Let that sink in. You're not lying to anybody else. And that's one of the things that is so interesting about this, because they end up conforming to the sinful people around them in their speech, their action, and their thinking. They conform. Their mode of thinking starts to be like the sinful world. The way that they talk becomes like the sinful world. Their actions, their way that they dress, the way they present themselves looks like the sinful world. And when people are deceiving themselves like this, they'll often think that they're being stealthy. No one notices. I am just so good that no one notices the sin I'm indulging in. Well, we all can tell. We see the change in actions. We see the change in speech patterns. You're only deceiving yourself. God's not deceived. The people around you aren't deceived. You're only deceiving yourself. Just like Judah and Jerusalem. Judah and Jerusalem were deceiving themselves, thinking, hey, we can take in the sinful things of the world around us and still be God's chosen people. Father Abraham will snatch us from the gates of hell. Literally, one of their Jewish traditions said that Father Abraham stood at the gates of Hades, and any Jew that started to pass by, he would snatch them out. But God said something different. He says, do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. So he says, become sober-minded as you ought, and stop sinning. For some have no knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame. Become sober-minded as you ought and stop sinning. See, just like Zephaniah's time, we must use sober thinking and put away the sinful influences. Think clearly. God gave us a mind that can reason through things. We are smart people. We need to use that sober thinking. Think clearly and put out those sinful influences. Romans 12 speaks to this. Romans 12, 1 and 2. Romans 12, 1 and 2, familiar passage to many of us, says, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." Now, you've heard me say this before, and I'll say it again next time we read this passage. The New American Standard doesn't do a very good job translating the last part of this verse. New American Standard says, which is your spiritual service of worship. The Greek literally says, which is your reasonable service. The word worship isn't in there. I think the New King James says reasonable service. Meaning, it's only logical for you to present yourselves a living sacrifice to God because Christ came and died for your sins. It's only logical, it's reasonable that you offer yourself as a living sacrifice. Verse 2, let's focus on verse 2. "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." Do not be conformed to this world. Let's go back to our friend that we were talking about a minute ago, who's deceiving themselves, thinking that they can indulge in sinful influences and stay away. Well, the plain fact of the matter is you'll never help people escape sin by joining them in their sin. Build an analogy for a sec. Imagine someone who's stuck in a tar pit, right? They're not getting out by themselves. You don't help them out of that tar pit by jumping in with them. "Now we're in this together, let's get out." You're both going to die. How do you save them? You stand on something solid and unmovable, you give them a branch or a rope, and you pull them to safety without getting in the tar. Same thing with sin. Now, I'm going to get a little bit direct for young people. A lot of young people think, well, I want to reach my boyfriend or girlfriend for Christ, and so I have to sleep with them so they'll stay with me so I can help them get out of their sin. No, you're never going to pull them out of their sin by joining them in their sin. Same thing with your friends that do drugs or drinking or whatever other sin that is out there. Oh, I have to connect with them, so I have to join them in it so they know that I'm a real person so I can help them get out of it. No. You're never going to help them escape their sin by joining them in that sin. Okay, well, I'm not doing the sin, I'm just around them while they're doing the sin. Well, you'll never influence your friends towards righteousness by showing approval for their sin. You know, say you have friends that are druggies, and you want to reach them. So you go and you hang out with them while they're shooting up. Well, they're going to take that as approval. You're not going to influence them out of that by joining them while they're doing their sin. They're going to think, well, you approve of it. So what do? Well, you invite them to something righteous. I'm doing this. If you want to come and hang out with me, you're welcome. But I'm not going to go where you're doing your sin. And they may choose not to join you. And that's between them and God. See, just like in Zephaniah's time, we must allow our thinking to be transformed by God's word. He says there in verse 2, "But be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect." See, by conforming our hearts and minds to God's will, we can then influence those around us towards godliness. We conform our minds and hearts to God. He changes us from the inside out. We're conforming to Him, and then we can influence those around us from that place of safety rather than in the mire with them. So today, we've been looking at this sermon that's talking about look around, looking at God's wrath on the nations surrounding Judah. And we saw that Judah and Jerusalem had allowed the influence of the sinful nations to corrupt them. And we looked at some lessons for our time, that we also need to stay away from those sinful influences. Get those sinful influences out of our lives, conform to God rather than conforming to sin. So my friends, each of us, take a look at who influences you and to whom you conform. Now, we might have some nonconformists in the room that say, I don't conform to anybody. Yes, you do. You conform to somebody. Who do you let yourself conform to? Are you conforming to the sinful world? Or are you conforming to God and His Word? Are you trying to look as much like the world as possible, or are you trying to look like God's people? Think about the influences in your life. Only you know your influences. I don't know the influences in your life. And then remove the influences of anyone or anything that influences you towards sin. Drop the leash. You know, that imagery of the dogs. Drop the leash. Let them run away. Because your salvation is more important. And in practical terms, that may be cutting off some friends. Saying, hey, I'm going to be doing righteous things. If you want to be my friend, that's where you're going to be too. And maybe you might lose those friendships. It might mean losing hobbies that you enjoy. Movies or TV shows or video games or books or whatever else that you enjoy. Well, let them go. Jesus said, if your right eye makes you stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. He wasn't saying literally pluck your eye out. He was saying get rid of those influences. Get them out of your life. Remove the influences of anyone or anything that influences you towards sin. Now, my friends, while we're closing out our sermon, maybe you know right now the influences that are pulling you towards sin. And maybe you want to get done with that. You want to be done with letting those influences have control of your life. This is a great time to start. The time to start is now. Get those things out of your life. We, as the congregation, want to help you in that. We are your support network. We are your family. And so when we have our invitation song in just a moment, I encourage you to come up to the front. One of our elders, we have all three of our elders here, one of them will come talk to you. And maybe you're with us and you're not yet a Christian. You haven't been baptized into Christ. We want to help and facilitate with that. So if you have a need, whatever it may be, please let it be known as Richard leads us in this invitation song.
Thank you for watching. For a deeper study of God's Word, contact us through our website in the description of this video. Lakes Region Church of Christ invites you and your family to Bible classes for all ages on Sunday morning, and join us for worship. We also offer other scheduled Bible classes. See you soon.